It's franchise tag day in the NFL, but the Jets' top free agent to be is unlikely to receive the franchise tag from the team. We'll go into it today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, February 21st, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Again, that's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Well, today we have our weekly mailbag show. Each Wednesday, we try and do a mailbag with listener questions. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. Our first question is about Bryce Huff. John, the franchise tag window opens today. Is there any chance the Jets will give Bryce Huff the franchise tag, potentially to either keep him or trade him? And that is a great question. Reports indicate that it is unlikely, and I'm not surprised that it's unlikely. Now, of course, I'm very disappointed with the way the Jets have handled Bryce Huff. If you're an everydayer, you don't need me to tell you that. I think that the way this has been handled on many levels has not been great, and I think it's very likely Bryce Huff will not be a member of the New York Jets in 2024. And when you have a homegrown pass rusher who plays a premium position and just recorded 10 sacks, that's a guy you'd like to keep. But it does not seem like the Jets are on track to keep Huff, either by giving him the franchise tag or by working out a longer-term deal with him. And, it occurs to me that, I always use these terms like franchise tag, and some listeners may not know what that is. Now, in the NFL, each team has the opportunity to give one player each year what's known as the franchise tag. And essentially, it goes to a player who's about to hit free agency. And if the team gives the player the franchise tag, the player then receives a one-year contract offer, and his salary for that 1 year will be the average of the top 5 salaries at his position. And there are some other nuances to it. I mean, there are some things we could really get into the weeds on, and there are some other things we could talk about, but that's essentially the nuts and bolts of it for the most part. And there are potentially ways a team could still get the player who gets the franchise tag, but for all intents and purposes, it prevents a player from hitting free agency. And the fact that the salary is so high is maybe one of the biggest reasons that the Jets are very unlikely to give Huff the franchise tag. And if you look at I don't think the official numbers have been put out yet, but the great website overthecap.com, which is like the number one salary cap resource for any NFL fan, it's something you should bookmark on your device or your computer. They estimate that the franchise tag number for a defensive end is going to be in the range of $20 million. And that's a problem for the Jets because the Jets just don't have much cap space right now. I mean, there are various different projections about how much the Jets have, but at the end of the day, right now, the Jets only have a few $1 million in cap space. They'll be able to clear out some additional cap space, through restructures, through cutting some players like CJ Uzomah, but Jets will remain very tight against the cap. And it's not just about how much cap space you have. It's also about what you need. If you're tight up against the cap, but you don't have any needs, you're in pretty good shape. The Jets are tight up against the cap, and they need 2 starting tackles. They need at least 1 more receiver, probably 2. They need defensive end help. They got to add a safety or 2. There's a lot the Jets have to do without much cap space. And while they will be able to clear out some cap space through restructures, through some other moves, through some releases, potentially through some trades, the bottom line is they're not going to have much cap space. They have a lot of needs to fill. And any long-term contract the Jets work out is probably going to have to be backloaded. It's probably going to have a minimal 2024 cap hit, and they'll have a big cap hit 2025, 2026. And that's just to fit everybody in. So I think the way the Jets are looking at it is if you give a player the franchise tag, it's only a 1-year deal. And the entire cap hit has to be that year. So, if the Jets gave Bryce Huff a contract with $20 million in guarantees, and it's a longer-term deal, they could spread the cap hits out over multiple years. But a 1-year franchise tag contract for $20 million, the entire $20 million cap hit has to take place in 2024. So they could give him the tag and they could work out a longer-term deal that lowers the 2024 cap hit, but that's a risk because they really have not done much negotiating, according to reports, to bring Huff back. And they've not made an offer. There was one report that they've not even made Huff an offer at this point. So it shows you they're kind of far away. So if they gave Huff the franchise tag with the intention of working out a longer-term deal, well, they don't know whether they'll be able to do it or not. And the Jets, frankly, have not shown much of an inclination towards doing that. If they gave him the tag and looked to trade him, well, that's also a risk because you don't know whether a team's going to want to deal for him. Part of the challenge is, I think, any team that trades for Huff is going to have to work out a longer-term contract with him. And again, unless you have a deal already lined up, it's going to be very difficult. And to get a deal lined up, you're going to have to let Huff speak with that team's agent, that team's front office, and work out a longer-term deal. So there are lots of complications. Every year you hear about, will a team tag a player and trade him? And sometimes it happens, but it tends to be much easier said than done in this league. So I think it's based on reports, it doesn't sound like the Jets are going to do it. Those are the reasons why the Jets are very unlikely to do it. I mean, should they look to do it? I mean, I just don't like letting him leave under any circumstances, but I feel like if he's going to leave, you'd at least like to get something in return, because I view Huff as kind of a similar player to what DJ Reed was a couple of years ago. When the Jets signed DJ Reed back in 2022, it was like he had like this one good season where he kind of broke out in Seattle and he was an ascending player, but because he didn't have a big track record, the Jets were able to get him on a contract that was reasonable. I think something very similar is going to happen with Huff, where people are going to look at this really good record of production even before last season. Whenever he got playing time, he made the most of it, even though he didn't get much playing time prior to last season. And then last year, when they finally gave him some regular snaps, he broke out and had over 10 sacks in less than half the snaps. So, I think some team's going to really do well and be very happy signing Bryce Huff. Unfortunately, I don't think that team's going to be the New York Jets. All right, our next question. John, do you have any hope that Jason Brownlee or Xavier Gipson can play a role for this team going forward? I like what I saw from them near the end of the season in 2023. I think it's possible. Now, I don't think it's fair to get on Xavier Gipson or Jason Brownlee the way you'd get on Randall Cobb or Alan Lazard, guys who were brought in for big roles, who were signed specifically because the Jets thought they would play well. But, I think if we're being realistic, they did not do a whole lot last season. Outside of Gipson, of course, won the game against Buffalo week 1. But outside of that, those guys did not produce a whole lot. I think if you give anybody regular snaps in this league at the receiver position, they're going to catch an occasional pass. I mean, if you play long enough, your number is going to come up. They're both undrafted guys. I think when you're talking undrafted guys, the hope is they develop into quality depth players. You think the hope is that they develop into a role kind of guy. But I don't think either of them is really in the long-term planning for the Jets. If either of them steps up and becomes a quality starter, I view it as a pleasant surprise. But I certainly don't think you can go into this season with your plan A being these guys are going to play big roles for this team. I think the hope is that they develop into good backups, and maybe if you need them for a game or two, they can step into that. And that would be quite an accomplishment for guys like that, undrafted guys with very minimal expectations going in. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the front office. Joe Douglas, not a popular guy in the Jets fan base these days, and for good reason. Is the problem that he takes too many risks? Well, I'll tell you what I think as we continue on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Get your buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Again, that's $150 if your bet wins. The NBA regular season is winding down. Teams are playing for seeding. The top seeds are up for grabs in the NBA. Teams are trying to get one of those top 6 spots in each conference to avoid the play-in, or some teams are just trying to get into the play-in. It's an exciting time in the NBA, and right now you can bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams on FanDuel with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Again, remember, you get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. Again, it's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you every day. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes Monday through Friday and then bonus episodes as needed as news breaks. We continue now with our weekly mailbag. Our next question, John, do you think that Joe Douglas is too much of a risk taker? I ask because excessive risk-taking appears to be a common thread in Jets personnel mistakes, such as saving money on a backup quarterback instead of signing somebody and going with Zach Wilson. Another example would be largely drafting based on potential upside, like Mekhi Becton, Denzel Mims, and Jabari Zuniga. Will McDonald, it fits into this category as well, although I'm not suggesting McDonald was a mistake just yet, only that he was drafted for upside potential. So the question is, Joe Douglas too much of a risk taker? That's a really interesting way to view it. I never thought of it in those terms. And risks come in many shapes and sizes. So I think it's fair to say, I think the way it was framed is a pretty fair way to put it. But I think there are three issues I have with Douglas above all else. Number one, it kind of meshes with what the question had to say. I think that Douglas sometimes gets a little too cute. I think that there are moments where he thinks he can outsmart the rest of the league, where he thinks he's like found this hidden gem, where he's like this superior scout, where he could find talent where nobody else did. And you see it happen in free agency, where you bring in guys like Brashad Perryman in 2020 or Jared Davis in 2021, Mecole Hardman last year, to a lesser extent, guys like Corey Davis and Carl Lawson, guys who Douglas watched with another team and says, you know what, we're going to get more out of that guy. And when we do, it's going to be a bargain, instead of just making the obvious move. And, as the question mentioned, he does it a lot in the draft. He drafts a lot based on upside. And again, I think that goes back to Douglas thinking, you know what, I can out-scout anybody. I can find a hidden gem where nobody else can. And it's great if you can do that. I mean, there are teams that do that really, really well, including Douglas's original team, the Baltimore Ravens. Like, there are some teams that just really are good at finding hidden gems. Unfortunately, the Jets have not really been that good in the Douglas era. I mean, there are a couple that have worked out. I mean, I think Sheldon Rankins worked out reasonably well, but for the most part, when Douglas tries one of these moves, it just doesn't pan out. So that's number one. Number two is, I think Douglas is not proactive enough. I think he's always reactive. He's always reacting to the latest crisis. And backup quarterback's a good example of that. I mean, if you're an everydayer, if you've been an everydayer for years, if you've listened to this show every day for 3-4 years, how many times have I been yelling about the backup quarterback spot under Douglas? He hasn't addressed it. And finally, now that the season fell apart, and the Jets, frankly, are overestimating how much of it was Zach Wilson's fault last year, but maybe that's a good thing, because the Jets will finally address the backup quarterback spot. For years, I've been saying this, but it took, they were never proactive. It's always reactive. Now that the season fell apart, we have to do something about it. Wide receiver. How many years have I been saying, get somebody to go with Garrett Wilson? How many times have I been saying it? Load up at this position, get multiple impact players. I've been saying it for a long time. But now, after the season fell apart because of Allen Lazard and Randall Cobb, we're finally doing it. There's never proactive movement. How much have I been talking about Huff? A year ago, I said, re-sign Huff. Now, I'd be lying to you if I thought he was going to have 10 sacks this year in a full-time role, but it was a perfect example of a guy who the Jets could have gotten to leave money on the table. If the Jets had worked on an extension with Huff last year, he probably would have taken it, and it probably would be one of the best contracts in the league. But they even had opportunities during the season. They should have opened up contract extensions with Huff in October when it was clear he was having a breakout year. They just wouldn't do it, though. It's always reactive. And now what will happen is Huff will leave, and, the usual suspects will say, hey, great move by Douglas. Huff's new team overpaid him. Jets couldn't afford that. Well, this is the point. The Jets should have been proactive there. So that's number two. Those are my second issue with Douglas. Issue number three is the cap management's been awful. And there's really no way around it. And the cap guy is the same. The Jets kept the McCagnon cap guy. So last year I kept seeing these people saying, well, we run the cap so much better now than we did under McCagnon. No, you don't. You have the same guy running it. I don't know how much this is being dictated from above with Woody, but the Jets cap management's been horrible. I mean, how do you have a team like this? How do you have an offensive roster like this and be at the salary cap? Because the teams that should be at the salary cap, the teams that should be capped out are teams with full rosters, not teams with like a great defense and a horrible offense. It should be with great offense and a great defense. So those are, I think, the big issues with Douglas. And I think I think saying that he's too much of a risk taker is an interesting way to frame it. And I think that the way it was framed was very fair. But those are the issues I have with Douglas. Next question, John. How many offensive linemen on the roster right now do you see as 2024 opening day starters? And where do they find the replacements for the 24 starters not currently on the roster? Free agency, draft, or a trade? It's a tough call. I think that there's probably two right now. Elijah Vera Tucker, who we know is very good when he's on the field. When he's on the field is the operative phrase there. And Joe Tippmann. And Tippmann, near the end of the season, I was like a little up and down on Tippmann because he had some bad games. But then I started thinking it through and I started rewatching, and I saw how broken the infrastructure was around Tippmann. And, more and more, I feel like Tippmann's going to be really good. My confidence level is in Tippmann's growing. The more I think this through, and the more I rewatch of things, Tippmann's a player. So we have two. Where do they get the other guys? I mean, it's tough. It's really hard to overhaul an offensive line. I keep saying people say, well, the Jets just need to get 3 offensive line. We're gonna get better offensive linemen in here next year. Well, they've been trying to do that for like 5 years. Every year for 5 years, we've been hearing the Jets are going to get better offensive linemen in here. Easier said than done. The really good offensive linemen in this league typically don't hit the market. I mean, Micah Wenu from New England, young tackle entering his prime, is a guy I would really target. I think the center position might be a spot where I look, because I more and more I like the idea of kicking Tippmann out to guard, just because I think he may have more value there than he does at center. I think obviously it's very likely the Jets are going to use the 10th overall pick on the tackle. I think Joe Alt-Falling would be the dream, but Fuaga out of Oregon State could be an option. Fashanu out of Penn State. One of those guys is very likely. If it's not a wide receiver at 10, it's almost certainly going to be an offensive tackle. So it's going to have to be a mix. And the Jets are probably going to have to roll the dice on some low-value free agent. Maybe they bring Connor McGovern back off a bad season where he was injury-plagued. Maybe they look to bring George Fant back off a good season in Houston. The guys who aren't going to cost a whole lot. But I just don't think like every piece they add can be a big resource. They only have one draft pick. They only have one first-round pick in the top 10, and they only have so much to spend in free agency. So they're going to have to hit on some guys, some mid-level guys, and just hope that somebody runs into a really good season. It's easier said than done, though, right now. And really, there's only 2 guys I can guarantee you are going to be in the starting lineup week 1 if they're healthy, and that's Joe Tippmann and Elijah Vera Tucker. I'm not even sure where the 2 of them are going to play right now. AVT, there's starting to be rumblings. Maybe they're going to kick him out to tackle, which kind of flies in the face of what they said a few weeks ago about how we think he keeps getting injured because we keep moving him all around. He keeps getting injured at tackle. But it's going to be kind of tough. Now, one way the Jets can add to their offensive line would be trading down in the draft, adding an extra pick or 2 and using that extra pick or 2 on offensive linemen. Would a trade down make sense, though? How far would the Jets have to move down to recoup their second-round pick? These are the questions I'll try and answer as we continue on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday. We're doing our weekly mailbag show. Our next question, about how far do you think the Jets would have to trade back in round 1 to get a second-round pick? What do you think about trading back that far? So this is a good question, and to answer it, I consulted the trade value chart, which is the chart every team uses. And essentially, the way it works is every team assigns like a certain number of points to each pick. And this is like a chart that goes back 40 years to what Dallas used to do when Jimmy Johnson was there. And every team essentially uses the same chart. And that's how they value picks. The first pick on the chart is worth 3,000 points. The second pick is worth 2,600 points. The third pick is worth 2,200 points, and so on. It keeps dropping the further you get. Essentially, the way these trades work out is typically you add up the value of the picks going in one direction, you add up the value of picks going in another direction, and they're roughly equal. So I consulted the chart to see, like, first of all, there are some teams picking immediately behind the Jets that don't have a second-round pick, so they could not work a trade out with those teams. But I think the earliest the Jets could trade back to would probably be 17 with Jacksonville. Because if you add up the Jets pick at 10 with Jacksonville's first and second round picks, they're about equal. And I think like to make the value equal, the Jets would have to send their 4th round pick to Jacksonville. So it'd be like the Jets' 1st round pick and their 4th round pick in exchange for Jacksonville's 1st round pick and 2nd round pick and their 1st round picks at 17. So you're dropping from 10 to 17. You're sending Jacksonville a 4 and you're getting a 2 back. Now, if you don't want to do that, if you don't want to like have to send an extra pick, probably we'd be talking about 18, where you get you'd be dealing with Cincinnati. And you'd get 18 and 49, and that's just about equal. 18 and 49 for Cincinnati, that would be worth 1,310 points, and Jets' 10th pick is worth 1,300 points. So maybe, I don't know, maybe the Jets would send a late pick, or maybe it's so close that you could just get 18 and 49. So we're probably talking like the 17, 18 range at earliest, depending on whether you want to send another later pick over to the team trading with the Jets. So the bottom line is, to get a second round pick, we're probably talking about dropping 7-8 spots in the 1st round. Would I do that? Yes. Here's why I do it. And I know people are going to say, well, you're costing yourself a plug and play guy at tackle. You're going to cost yourself a guy who can play immediately. Well, we don't know that. And if you look historically through the NFL, especially the recent history of the NFL draft, there's really not that big of a difference between drafting 10 and drafting at 17, 18 when we're talking about career outcomes. Now, the perception is that, and this happens every year. The perception is 10's much better than 17, 18. But in reality, there are scenarios where you whiff at 10 and the guy at 17, 18 is really good. There are scenarios where the guy at 10 is good, but the guy at 17, 18 is just as good, if not better. And yes, you'd rather have 10 than 17 and 18. You would not like do a trade up 10 for 17 or 10 for 18. But if you add 17 and 18 to a second round pick, you're usually going to get a better outcome than 10. That's just the way it works. And it's counterintuitive. And like many aspects of NFL team building, what's good for building a team runs in the face of the conventional NFL media wisdom. So you get criticized for doing it. And if the Jets traded down, and this is why I kind of doubt they'll do it, they'll get criticized because they'll be saying, how can you not add a blue chip player at 10 for Aaron Rodgers? Why are you trading down and adding these extra players? Well, sometimes what happens is the guy picked at 10 is no good. The guy picked at 17 is no good. But the second round pick you had, that guy's good. Second round pick is really valuable. And the other aspect of this, when we're talking long-term team building, you can't keep having drafts short on picks. And this is one of those things that's difficult to connect the dots on. But sometimes the team gets into a spot where their roster is really thin and they don't have young players. And people ask, how did this happen? Well, in many cases, it happens because you did not have enough picks. You were not adding enough young talent because you were short on picks 2-3 years earlier. So I think when we're talking outcomes, I think when we're talking team building, it would make sense for the Jets to do that, but it would be an unpopular move in the fan base. It would be an unpopular move in the media. And I'll just say it. Jets have really been focused on fan reaction and media reaction the last year or so at the expense of good team building. So I don't think it'll happen. I think it would be worth it, though. Next question. Can a healthy Aaron Rodgers and a miracle happen and the Jets win the Super Bowl? Sure. Reality is this will not happen, and it's all thanks to Woody. Woody is very thin-skinned. If we as Jets fans want real change, the name of our pain is Woody. What do you think Jets fans will have to do to have enough and actually start to vocalize this at games, billboards, radio shows, beat writers, podcasters, and bloggers? So the question really boils down to, what's it going to take for fans to stand up and say, Woody, sell the team? And as far as podcasters goes, well, you got me on board. Woody, sell the team. Please sell the team, Woody. I'm on board with this idea. I don't know that there's anything we can do to make Woody sell the team, but certainly would be a good thing for the Jets, I think. And our last question, taking out of the equation the fact that the Jets are going all in this year and don't care about the future, is there any package you would be willing to pay to move to a higher pick to get a quarterback in what is evaluated to be a tremendous quarterback class? Do you actually agree this is a stacked quarterback class? If so, should that mean it's possible to get one later in the draft? So a lot of good questions here. Look, I'm going to be honest with you. Because the odds are so low, the Jets are drafting a quarterback in the top 10. I really haven't focused that much on this year's quarterback class. From what little I've seen, I don't love Caleb Williams as much as the conventional NFL wisdom. I think he'd probably be the number one pick. I mean, based on what I've seen, but I have not explored this in an in-depth way the way I would a year the Jets were all in on a quarterback. The question, though, is, hypothetically, would I be willing to move up from 10 to go get one of these quarterbacks this year? And I think the answer to that would be no. Now, if a quarterback falls to 10, I think that would be something I would look at. But the problem with moving up in the top 10 to get a quarterback is you have to pay such a high price. And the Jets are already short on picks. So the Jets don't have a second round pick to trade. So any move up for a quarterback would almost certainly mean the 2025 first round pick going and more. And one thing I've seen through the years in the NFL is that the teams that pay a huge amount to move up for a quarterback typically live to regret it. And part of the reason is you give up so much, you give up so many draft picks that you don't have the resources to surround your quarterback with enough talent. Jets can relate to this. 2018, they give up 3 second-round picks to move up 3 spots for Sam Darnold. This is we gave up a second-round pick for each spot they moved up for Darnold. And Jets roster ended up short on talent. Now, there were other reasons, but that did play a role. What I was just talking about. A couple of years down the line, your roster's not that good. How did this happen? We were short on draft picks. We did not add enough young talent to the mix. So, you can draft a quarterback, but you also have to ask yourself, are we putting this young man in a position where he can actually succeed? And in many instances, Bryce Young is the most recent example. If you switch Bryce Young and CJ Stroud, I have no doubt CJ Stroud's going to look better than Bryce Young did in Carolina. I have no doubt that Bryce Young would look better in Houston, where he's got a better supporting cast than he did in Carolina. But I think Stroud would have a lot more struggles if he didn't have, if he wasn't in Houston. I think Young would look better if he wasn't in Carolina. And these are things you have to consider because most young quarterbacks can't step into the league and light it on fire. Most young quarterbacks require a stable infrastructure around them. So I think when you're talking about what it would take to move up, it's almost certainly, it's probably going to be more than your 2025 first round pick, depending on how high you want to get up. But I just don't think it's worth doing unless you can put your young quarterback in a position where he has a realistic chance of succeeding. And I don't think the Jets would be able to do that. Now, if a quarterback falls to 10 and all you have to do is invest one first round pick in him, I think that's something you should consider. I don't think the Jets will, but I think it's something they should consider. But those are my thoughts on that. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Hope you have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.